Notice in your 8 hours a day of reading journal articles now for the last week, and figure out how many hours that has been, right? I'm drawing on what, 56 hours worth of experience times 10? Wow, we should have a wealth of information here. What differences have you noticed? You haven't noticed any. You haven't had to think about it this way before.
The lab reports that we do are pretty much the same as, like, we follow the exact same format. We have, like, we're directed in our lab classes to write our lab reports as if they were journal articles. So, like, the results discussion and, like, abstract intros all.
Okay, so now that you've said that, how do you handle your results?
Well, generally what we do is in methodology, in the method section, we don't mention any results at all. Like,
right, that's methods. How do you handle your results?
I'm just letting an intro here, but
oh,
yeah.
Okay.
So we don't mention any, and then once the results sections come, there's a specific section where we. Well, actually, this can vary from person to person, but usually what it is the results are laid out, the graphs are all tied in to and you never put a graph in without referencing it, obviously.
Okay.
But then after the results section, where all the data has been portrayed, you tie everything together by coming to like quantifiable conclusions from the data that you've collected, and that's in the discussion section. And then that conclusion is just sort of there's no data in the conclusion section for the most part. It's just like what you can take from it, like any physical results, maybe of what your experiments showed, that kind of thing.
Okay. So when you all write a method for a lab, right, how detailed is it?
Extremely detailed.
Extremely detailed? Not that detailed. Not that, okay. And I would say that that's one difference between a journal article and a lab report, right, is that once you write a journal article of something, research that you have conducted, your method section is going to be more detailed than what you would find in the lab report. All right, now tell me why. There's a logical reason for why. You all think English and writing is not logical. It's really quite logical. We have a lot more in common, engineers and scientists and English people than on the surface it appears. Yeah?
I was going to say that maybe the methods in a journal are more detailed because when other people are reading an article, sometimes people like to repeat experiments or do something similar. Or
what do you mean they like to repeat? Tell us, research. Doesn't your research have to be repeatable?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
If it worked before, it should happen again with the same method.
Well, I guess I was picking apart your words, would like to, right?
Exactly.
Because it's not would like to. It has to be able to be repeated, right?
Exactly.
And it can only be repeated based on the amount of detail that you give, right? Now, in a lab report, why is that not really needed? It's a lab, right? It's in the context of a class. The person who's going to be looking at this, number one, probably sat there with you while you were doing it, right? And perhaps that person even wrote the lab, right? And so the purpose, the audience for a lab, right, is class instructor, lab instructor. The purpose of a lab is, did you actually pick up the principles and can you apply them that we've talked about in class, right? That's the purpose of it, right? So quite often, and you said something very different than I'm guessing a lot of labs do, is you said you can't reference results, you can't have them there without referencing. Quite often in lab reports, isn't it just for the results section, just table or graphic aid, whatever, just one right after another with nothing in between pretty much.
Yeah, that's like the opposite of what we're supposed to do.
Well, right, yeah, and again, the reason for that is, for the most part, is that it's a lab report, right? And you're writing, the purpose of it and the audience is very different from what there is in a journal article. When you think about the important parts of what research is, the methodology and the results are two of their very critical points, right? Your results are only as good They're only as valid and reliable as your method was thorough and valid and reliable. And journal articles, right? Journal articles are not, let me see if you understand the principles that we talked about in the class. A journal article is cutting edge, right? It's brand new research. If it's not going to get published, right? It's got to be something that's going to add to the research conversation that's going on. So if you're going to think about it in that context, your audience needs to know your methodology in detail so that we've got some idea of how carefully and what you exactly did for this lab, for this experiment, or this research. Because otherwise I can't repeat it, correct? Rather than I would like to, right? It's I couldn't, so you don't have that repeatability that you need. And I also can't make any judgment based on how reliable and valid I think your results are because you haven't supported how you got them. Does that kind of make sense to you? So when you start moving to a journal article, those two ideas are very different from, except for you, from what a lot of traditional lab reports are, and maybe some of the others of you, you're the one that spoke up. But quite often, that's what, and I mean, the first time when my students were writing their scientific journal articles, I was getting like just result after result after result and nothing in between. And again, if this is brand new research, you've got to tell me what it is these results are, because I'm not going to know. I'm coming at it as a brand new audience, and you're going to be telling me something that we didn't know before, right? So yes, you've got to flesh those two parts out a lot more than sometimes happens in a lab report. Now, the introduction and the discussion part, how do they differ from a research paper? Have you noticed anything about how they differ in what you've been reading?
Most of the introductions for a lab report are the chemistry behind, or like science lab reports are
Right, yeah.
chemistry, or about the chemistry and the science behind it, as opposed to possible applications of the technology that you discovered.
Okay. Anything else you've noticed in your hours upon hours about reading journal articles about introductory part or the conclusion discussion part? The other two parts other than the results and the methods.
Compared to what? So
Compared to a research paper.
Okay.
Yeah, because I mean, it's really hard. A journal article is not a lab report and it is not a research paper. And what happens is most beginning writers of journal articles, as you begin your career, whether it's now or when you graduate or you get a graduate degree and you start writing, one of the problems in making this transition is to move from writing for as a student for a teacher and moving beyond that to write as a professional. So that's the reason, for my question is there's a difference. You've written lab reports and you've probably written a lot of research papers. And so those are the kind of the ways you start thinking about putting this together. And there's a lot of difference between what those genres are. So have you noticed anything? Yeah.
The abstracts on journal report is even a lot shorter. It seems like I forget what the rule is. I had a TA tell me something to be 10%, no less than 10%. It was like 5% of your actual journal length should be your abstract.
Quite often the length of your abstract is determined by the journal. It says we want abstracts of 125 words.
Yeah, so they're
yeah.
really short and just kind of
Right.
exactly say what's going to happen. Whereas in lab reports and research, a lot of times we talk about the science that makes this next part make sense. Like we're using, let's say, like Ohm's law to do all this lab. So an
Okay.
abstract would do that.
And what were you going to say?
Yeah, the intro and the journal articles I read have referenced previous research, and then the conclusion just has what you did, your results. It doesn't go back, whereas I've done papers where you re-reference what you did before, like at the end, but they just have what is the final, the conclusions, like what finally happened, and then other papers, you'll say what you did a little bit more, like the intro, how you do like the process behind it. And some journal articles I've read, this is previously done, and this is how you're just basically going to make it better.
Okay, yeah, and I mean, one of the things you also have to remember is, and this is one of the, well, part of the problem with methodologies and results when you first begin doing this is you are so used to making them so cut and dry, so meager, so lacking of detail. And you're used to writing a research paper and so you take those kinds of skills, and research papers are, at least from your perspective, are much less cut and dry than what you would put in a methodology and a discussion. And to be really honest with you, what you consider a research paper is probably too wordy even for a real research paper. It can be by far much more concise than what you're used to, because most journal articles are really concise, right? All right, now define concise for me. What does concise mean?
Doesn't say more than it needs to.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
There's just enough information.
Quite often we have this idea. I guess I should use a different color. My green is not doing so good. Quite often we have this idea that being concise equals short. It does not. I mean, being concise is not the same thing as being short. And you have a tendency to start and think about, yes, it's very straightforward, it's very concise. That's not the same thing as short. We can do ratios in English even. There's a one-to-one correspondence. Every single word has to carry and give meaning. If you aren't doing that, then you're not being concise, then you're being wordy. But it has nothing to do with the length of what you're writing. You can write me 5,000 words, and you can be very concise. Every word is telling me something that I need to know. You can write me a 100-word paragraph, and you can be wordy, because every single word is not adding meaning to what you're saying. And what happens is that you start writing some of these openings and endings, and you end up being very unconcise because you're thinking in terms of a research paper rather than thinking in terms of a publishable article. But when you get to your methodology and results, you're so concise that the reader is not going to follow what you're talking about because you aren't providing the logical flow and the argument and the reasoning behind what you've done. All right, so what I'm going to give you here is the basic structure. Now, this is, by definition, going to be generic. And it's going to be generic because, A, we don't have a particular journal that we are thinking of submitting to. And every journal has got its own little style sheet, or own large style sheet. It's going to tell you exactly what it is that you have to include. Sometimes they even go so far as to say, here are the headings that you have to use. Some are going to be that particular in what they want. Some are not. So what we're talking about here is just by nature going to be very generic. And it's to give you just a basic structure so that you can kind of take it and apply it as you need it. Nothing is really carved in granite. And you take these ideas and you realize for your particular piece of research how you need to modify it, what you need to do in order to have it fit whatever it is that you are writing. Format never dictates content. Content is always written and then it is formatted. All right, does that make sense to yours that sound like Greek? You don't start off with this container and dump your content in there. You start off with the content, and then after that, you put the format that you need. Format is just very physical. It's how does it kind of look on the page. Your content is actually what you're telling me. All right, so what drives content? How do you know what content to put in? Those of you who have taken a technical writing class, you probably have heard this, I would think. Nothing like putting those of you who've had one on the spot. No idea. Okay. All right, your content is dictated by your topic, your purpose, and your audience. Why are you writing this, right? Because that is how you're going to focus what it is and what you're presenting, right? Are you trying to show this new development and its applications? Right, that's a purpose, right? And that's how then you would structure what kind of focus and emphasis you would give. Are you trying to show how this new device that you have developed, how it compares and contrasts with the ones that are already out there? What are the advantages, the disadvantages, the benefits? That's a different purpose, right? And you're going to focus what you're saying differently because of that. Who is your audience? If your audience is fellow academics, fellow professionals on the same level that you are in the same field, that's going to be one kind of audience. If your audience is going to be me, right, that's an entirely different audience, right? And the language you're going to use, the way you're going to